back to another episode here at GoRails. Recently I put out a video on deploying Ruby on Rails applications to render. There was a fair amount of setup involved in that process, and it would be nice if we had an easier way to set that up all the time in our applications without having to remember everything that we needed to do, or have a reference to it somewhere so that we can copy and paste in the code all the time. So today what we're going to do is we're going to create a Railsbyte to help us in this process, so that anytime for any new applications we create, we want to deploy them to render, we can simply copy the link to the Railsbyte for deploying to render, run that in our terminal where our Rails application is, and it will generate all of the code and files needed in order to configure our application to be ready to deploy to render. So let's get started. All right, so first things first, let's go ahead and just kind of play around with a very simple Railsbyte here and kind of get a feel for how this works. So I'm going to click New Template. I'm just going to name this one Test, and then testing Railsbytes. Okay, we're not going to worry about any usage right now. And then in this section here, you can see it's labeled as script. This is where we write the our Ruby code that we want to run when we paste in the link for this script in our terminal. So as a quick exercise or example, let's just write a couple put statements here. So let's just say puts, do a bunch of stars there, do another puts, and let's say hello from Railsbytes. Great. Puts, let's surround those again. Looks like the right amount. Cool. And let's go ahead and click Create Template. So we just created our first Railsbyte template here, and now this is ready to be used. So let's fire up a new Rails application in our terminal, and then we'll copy this link to this Railsbyte and paste it into the terminal and run it, and let's see what happens. So first, let's go over to our terminal, and let's just say Rails new bytes. I'll hit enter on that. I'll let that execute and create our skeleton for our Rails application. And then once that is done, I'm going to cd into that directory. All right, now that the application skeleton has been generated, let's go into our new Rails application directory. I'm going to clear my terminal out here so that we have some room. And now let's go back to our Railsbyte, and let's copy to clipboard the link to our Railsbyte. So now that we have that, if we go back over to our terminal and we paste this in, again, make sure that you're inside the Rails application root for the project that you want to run this Railsbyte in. So paste that in and we'll hit enter, and then we should see some output here. So we see the code that we wrote in our script get printed out to the terminal here. So this is great. This means we have our first working Railsbyte, and now we can go back to it and start building out what we are trying to accomplish here, which is setting up a template for deploying Rails applications with render. So let's go do that now. All right, so back over in our Railsbyte template here, let's go edit template, and let's get rid of this, and let's kind of let's write out some pseudo code for what we want to do here. So there's 3 files that we want to touch with this. We want to make a bin/render.build.sh file. Let's go ahead and make a note of that. Create a bin/render.build.sh file, and then add build steps into it. The next thing we want to do is we want to create a a render.yaml file, and we want to add the render configuration setup into it. And then the last thing we want to do is we need to edit the config/puma.rb file and uncomment or by uncommenting the necessary lines. Okay, so at a high level, this is kind of the flow we want to happen here. So now that we have our first, high-level overview steps, now we can pick the first one of these and start working on implementing the code to make it happen. All right, so let's get started here. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to work on number 1 here. So I'm just going to put some space between the rest of these little comments here. So rereading this one quickly, it says create a bin/render-build.sh. Should probably clarify that. Say file, and we left out some other stuff too, and add build steps into it. Okay, so that's what we want to do here. So the way we're going to do this is by utilizing Ruby's file class. So we can say file.open, and then we want to give it the name of the file that we want to open, and this will create the file also if it does not exist. So we want to say bin/render-build.sh, close that string off. This file we want to open in write mode, so we'll pass in a W there, and then we're going to pass a block to the open method here. So we'll say do, and then we want that block to take the file as an argument to the block. So we'll say F there, and I'm going to go ahead and end this method off before I forget. And now we have this file open, and we can do things inside of that file, one of which being that we can write to the file. So the way to do that is let's just write a basic string here to this file. So we'll say f.write, and then we will give it a string here. So let's just say this came from a Railsbyte. Okay, great. So now let's go ahead and click Update Template. Oh, missed a closing brace there, or a closing paren. So let's go ahead and update this now. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and copy this to clipboard, and let's pop back over into our terminal. We'll clear this, and let's quickly hop into our editor and look inside of our current bin directory. So inside bin right now, we can see that we don't have any file named render-build.sh. So let's now get out of here, and let's paste in our Railsbyte code again, and let's run this. Okay, it ran. Let's now open up our editor again and look inside of our bin directory, and we now see that we've created a render-build.sh file, and if we go into it, we can see the string that we wrote to the file. This came from a Railsbyte. So this is great. So far so good. We successfully created the file, and we wrote something into it. Now we need to write the correct bits of information into this file. So let's look at how to do that next. All right, so back over here in our template for our Railsbyte, let's go ahead and we want to write out the build steps that we want to write into the file, like we're doing on line 3 right here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a constant called build steps, and that is going to be an array of steps. So the first thing we want to do in here is we want to make sure to set up a shebang line here. So we'll say user bin env, and then we want to say bash right here. And then we also want to be sure to include any kind of new lines in here so that we can format the file nicely and make it easily readable. So that's going to be our first line here. And then the next line, we want to say, this is just going to be a comment we're going to write in here to say exit on error. We'll add another new line here. Oops. and then close that one off. And now we will start adding in some build steps here. So let's say set -o or exit. Oops. And then let's go ahead and add some new lines. And then let's get into our bundle stuff. So now we want to say bundle and install will be our first real step here. Throw in a new line. And then we want to say bundle exec Rails assets precompile. And then let's give that a new line. And then we want to say bundle exec Rails assets clean. Give that a new line. And then we want to say bundle. Oops, we got a typo here. Let's fix that. Bundle exec Rails db migrate. Okay, great. So that should do it for our build steps here. I'm gonna give a little space between there. And so now what we want to do is we want to loop through this array of build steps, and we want to write each of these into the file below. So what I'm going to do down here is I'm going to say build steps. We're going to iterate over this array of build steps. So let's say build steps.each, and then let's say do step. Go ahead and end that off, and then I'm going to grab this line out of here and put it in here, and be sure to replace this string here with our step string coming in. So we are going to open the file and then yield that file to this block here, and inside of our block we are going to loop over our build steps array. And we're going to then, as we do that, each step we're going to write to the file, and then all the blocks will end, and at the end of this we will close our file. So let's go ahead and click update template. We can copy to clipboard here, and then we can go to our terminal. Let's go ahead and close this, and then now we can paste this code in and run it. Okay, great. And now let's open up our editor again, go into our bin directory, and go look inside of our render build.sh file. And you can see now it has written all of the build steps that we had in our array into this file. Also take note that it overwrote what was in there previously. So that's important to think about when you're writing to files, is where the pointer is in the file, and if it's in the wrong place and you're not intending it to be there, and you write to that file, you're going to overwrite some information that was in there previously. So something to keep in mind, to be mindful of, is overwriting existing things in these files. So now that we have that, let's move on to implementing the next step of this process. So one thing real quick, actually, before we move on to our second step here, is that this bin render build.sh file here that we are creating and writing to, one thing we need to make sure of is that this file is able to be executed. So we need to set the permissions on this file as we're working with it here, to make sure that it gets set to be executable. So what I'm going to do is, outside of the block where we're iterating over our build steps, but still inside the file.open block, what I'm going to do is make a call to file utils, and I'm going to say .commod, and then I'm going to pass it the permissions that I want to set on a given file. So I want to say a+x, that's the permissions I want to set, and then I want to give it either the name of the file, or in this case I'm going to pass it the file object like that. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's update our template, and then let's go back to our terminal and run this. So let's go over here. Let's copy to clipboard our Railsbyte. Let's paste that in, And then now let's list out the permissions for that file. So I'll say ls-la and then bin render build.sh, and we can see here the X's now are set on this file, so it is now set with executable permissions. Alright, so the next step here, we want to create a render.yaml file, and we want to render the configuration setup into that file. So this is going to be a YAML file here. Now the process here is going to be pretty similar to what we did above when we opened up the file for our render-build.sh file. A difference here though is that this time the configuration object that we're going to create, or that we're going to create a configuration hash in a little bit here, but we're going to want to take that hash and then convert it to YAML and dump those contents into the file that we create here. So to get going here, we can kind of follow along on line 12 and kind of mirror what we did up there. So we'll say file.open, and then this time the file we want to open is going to be called render.yaml, just like that. We also want to open this one up in write mode, and then we're going to pass it a block here and yield our file object to that block. Let's go ahead and end that off before we forget. And now inside of here, what we're going to want to do is make a call to YAML, and then we're going to call the dump method, and then inside this method is going to be, we want the contents of whatever we want to dump into a file, and the file we want to dump into is the one that we're yielding to the block here. So this part here is what we need to do next. We need to write out all of the configuration information that we want to put into this YAML file. So let's work on building out this hash object next. Alright, so I've gone ahead and made the configuration object that we need to send into our YAML dump call right here. I'm going to go ahead and paste that in above the code where we're opening our file here. And let's go up to the top and kind of look at this. So if you watched the last video about deploying to render that I did on Go Rails, this is the same information here. I'm just making a constant called render config, and that is a hash. And then inside of there is the same information that you see from the render.yaml file that we created in that video. It's just structured out as a Ruby hash object with a bunch of nested hashes and arrays. But you can go through this and compare it to the other video if you want, but it's the same object here, again just as a plain Ruby hash. So this object here is what we want to pass in to the YAML .dump call down here where we have this string. So we'll get rid of the strings, and I'm just going to paste in that name right there. And so let's go ahead and update this template. Let's copy it, and now let's go to our terminal, clear this, and let's go ahead and run this now and see if the end result is what we want. So I'm going to go ahead and run that, and then after that runs, I'm going to open up my editor, and we'll open up the render.yaml file and take a look. So we can see here that it, looks like it went successful. So this mirrors exactly the stuff that we have in the other in the deploy to render video, all the same configuration options. So now we can easily reuse this boilerplate setup here. You can add things in if you need to, but this is great. This simplifies a lot of this process so far. So this now gets us in a good place for having step 2 completed. Let's go move on to the third step here and start to wrap this up. Alright, so now that we've got that done, let's go back over here and edit our template, and let's go down to the bottom and check out our final step of what we want to do here. So I'm going to just kind of get rid of some of that extra space there, and then the last step we want to do is we want to edit the config puma.rb file by uncommenting the necessary lines. So let's first go open up that file in our editor, and let's look at what we want to do inside this file. So inside this file, what we want to do is we want to find within this file 2 lines. We want to find this line, the workers line right here, and then we also want to find this preload app line right here. And what we want to do is we want to uncomment both of these lines, and then also I would like to replace the 2 over here with a 4. So that's what we're looking to do in this file. So let's get out of this and go back into our template here, and let's look at how to do this. So again, we can kind of mirror line 51 here. We want to call file.open, and then we want to open up that file. So we'll say /config/puma.rb, and then this time though we want to open this file with read and write mode enabled. So R+ will open the file in read and write mode. So let's go ahead and then open up our block here and yield our file object to it. Okay, and end that off before we forget. So the first thing I want to do in here is I want to make sure to read through this file so that we have all of the contents of the file to be able to work with. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to say lines equals f.readLines, and the readLines method here will read the file, and it will take every line and insert it into an array as a new element. So after we read the whole file, we'll have a whole array of strings that each represents one line in this file. So now that we have the lines, what we want to do is we want to iterate over the lines, and we want to find the ones that we're looking for. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to first make a variable called updated Puma config, and then I'm going to set that equal to lines.map, and then I'm going to open up a block here, and we'll say line, and again lines here is the array of all the lines from the file that we just read. And then let's end this off before we forget that. And then inside here, what we want to do is we want to find lines that match a certain condition, and we want to uncomment them. The 2 lines we want to match against are the ones they start with a hash followed by a space, and then either say workers or preload. So we want to do that by using a regex and then substituting those sections with just empty space. So the way that is going to look here is I'm going to say line.sub, and then I'll do that in place, and then I'm going to pass a regex here, and then let's just close this off and then fill in our regex. So what we want to look for here is we want to say at the beginning of a line, if it starts with a hash and then a space, we want to substitute that with an empty string here. So that should get the first part and replace the strings. And then the next thing we want to do is we also want to sub the number 2 for 4. So that will replace the line in our workers line from 2 to 4, giving us more workers. So let's close that off. All right, so this represents all of the parts that we want to substitute from the lines, but now we want to make sure that we only do this for the 2 lines that we want to uncomment and modify in that file. We don't want to do this for every line, and right now any line that matches this first regex or the other substitution pattern will be changed. So we only want to do this if line.match, and then we're going to pass this a regex. So the regex that we're looking for here is kind of similar to this one here. So we'll say any line that begins with a hash and a space and then has either workers or preload on it. Okay, so that is going to be our regex right there. And then, let me go back up here because I also want to say line right here. So the reason I'm saying line right here is that when we're mapping over all of the lines, we're going to get back a new array containing any lines that have been modified and any lines that have not been modified. So we always want to make sure to return the line. This is why I did the bang sub method here. I want to do that modification in place on the string so that I can just put all the lines right back into an array and they'll all be modified. So that's about it for this section of it. We'll have an array of modified lines, but now what we need to do is we need to write those lines back into the file. So one important thing we need to do here is, since we've read the file, that means our pointer in the file is going to be at the end of the file. So we want to bring that back to the beginning and then write from the beginning of the file. So the way to do that is we'll say f, which is our file object that we yielded way up here. We'll say f.rewind, and then we'll say f.write, and then we'll pass it the updated Puma config. Oops. And then we're going to call it .join on that so that it's a big string instead of the array. So we'll write the big string that we just modified back to this file, and then the open method after this all executes will close the file automatically for us. So let's go ahead and update this template here. Let's copy it, and then let's go ahead back to our terminal, paste in this code, run it, and then we can go take a look at our config Puma file and see if what we just did worked. So I'm going to open up Vim here, config puma.rb, and now we should see, and we do, line 32 has been uncommented. Also take note that the number has been updated from 2 to 4, and then additionally our preload app line has been uncommented as well. So this is great. This now checks all 3 steps that we wanted to do to set up our application for deployment with render. Alright, so that's pretty much the introduction to creating a Railsbyte specifically for kind of getting one set up for working with render. I have a full Railsbyte that I created for this that is a little more in depth with things. We can see here I've pulled out some methods to use for writing to your build script, and also down here for generating the render YAML file, just so I can reuse those without having to write all this code again, somewhere up here. The other things that I've done here too are just kind of checks for if the file exists already. Let's prompt the user to ask if we want to overwrite the file, or if they want to overwrite the file. They can say yes or no. If they say yes, then we go ahead and run our generation of the build script file method here. If they don't, then we won't do anything. One thing I'm ensuring that we do is that the file is executable. Even if they have one already, maybe the user, the developer forgot to set that. This will make sure it gets done, because render will need that to be executable in order for them to use it up on the render site when building your application. Final little point here, you can see there's some handy commands on the side over here that you can use, one of which I used here, this yes one, and all of these link out to the documentation for them. So you can click on one to go find out more about how it works, and then you can feel free to use them inside your Railsbyte, kind of like I did right here. Alright, so that's how you make a Railsbyte. Hopefully you enjoyed that, and hopefully that kind of sparks some ideas for you, for things that you could go build for yourself and for others, to save your future selves some time in setting things up. So again, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.